of background about Max. Max is a retired GP in Liverpool, but he still sits as a doctor on Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, and he's also JP. My introduction to Max was through Raymond Hart, who was a fellow philatelist who started up our education committee and interests, and introduced me to the Judaica Philatelic Society that's run by Gary Goodman, who's also one of our viewers tonight. Max's main collecting interest is GB stamps, but he also has a minor thematic interest, including health, cycling, musicals, and Jews in the science and arts. The talk he's going to give is on historical plagues and the development of vaccines, a topical subject, of course, specifically relating to Jews who have been at the forefront in this field over the last 150 years or so. Surprising how many there are, and of course, with a philatelic slant. Over to you, Max.
Right, well, thank you very much, Michael, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. If I may, I will start sharing my screen now. Okay. Can everybody see that? I'll take it that if nobody said no, I assume everybody can. Yes, well, as Michael said, this is a very topical subject, which I first gave to the Judaica Thematic Society back in March. And at that stage, of course, we were already a year into this pandemic, and we'd already come across a couple of variants, the Kent, remember that name, Kent, which was later called Alpha variant, and then the so-called Indian variant, which was then renamed Delta. And the COVID vaccination campaign was on everybody's lips. Well, then, of course, as the year went by, society opened up, and I think maybe some of us were concentrating on more pleasant things. And it's really quite remarkable, isn't it, that it's only just over 3 short weeks since we heard the name Omicron, this potential nightmare that we're dealing with at the moment. So vaccines are well and truly back in the news. But the fact is that there's nothing remotely new about what we're dealing with at present. And I'm going to take a long view, looking at Jewish influences on plagues past and present, and I will throw in a little philately at the same time. Now, there are 2 reasons why I'm showing this photograph. The first one is because I like it, and the second one is because I took it. And this is the Liverpool skyline taken across the River Mersey from Birkenhead. To the left of the picture, you can see HMS Prince of Wales, which was on sea trials at the time. And then on the right, the rather odd wedge-shaped building is the Museum of Liverpool Life. And to the left of that are the 3 Graces, which are the Liver building, the Cunard building, and the Port of Liverpool building. And I was born and educated in Liverpool. I will just show you one other building in Liverpool, and this is the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, which opened in 1898 and was the first institution in the world dedicated to research and teaching in tropical medicine. And I will just mention this building again later. So plague is in the title of my talk. What do we mean by plague? Well, it has several usages, and strictly speaking, it's a very contagious infection caused by Yersinia pestis. But we also use the word to describe a large number of insects or animals infesting a place. And of course, when we are troubled by something, we often say that we are plagued by it. Now, biblically speaking, when we talk about plagues, we think of the 10 plagues. Now, as far as I know, there are no stamp sets anywhere in the world that are purely related to the 10 plagues. However, there is a Pesach Haggadah, which is illustrated with stamps, but only 3 of the actual plagues are represented, and you can see them on the screen there. We have frogs, pestilence, and locusts. So, of course, we're dealing with our very own 21st century plague, COVID-19, which is still evolving and mutating, and who knows whether we are nearer the end or the beginning of this. Just a little more philately at the moment. At the end of last year, about 20 countries worldwide, and there are more now, the 20 countries had issued stamps relating to COVID. I've acquired a few of them. The one at the top is from Bosnia-Herzegovina, and that shows those horrible coronavirus particles smashing their way through a brick wall while somebody in a hazmat suit unsuccessfully tries to hold them back. And then at the bottom, we have a couple of stamps from the Czech Republic, which show the logos of first responders and emergency services on face masks. Alderney in the Channel Islands also released a set called Spirit of the Islanders. These were drawings by children, and they show allegedly positive things to come from the pandemic. So we've got the emergency services, bubbles, do you remember bubbles? Rainbows and family time. Now let's just talk a little bit about the history of the plague. Well, there have been 3 major pandemics through recorded history. The first, called the Plague of Justinian, occurred in the 6th and 7th century. And although it's not known exactly how many people died, it's certain that there were many millions. And this completely disappeared in the 700s. And it was another 700 years before it reappeared, known as the Black Death, the second pandemic. And would you believe, but there were recurrent epidemics for 400 years. I suppose we'd call them waves now, including the Great Plague of London in 1665 and 6. The third plague pandemic started in China in the mid-19th century, and it spread to India and caused between 12 and 15 million deaths. It became pandemic in the 1890s, and in fact, plague was active until the 1960s, when, according to the World Health Organization, there were less than 200 deaths a year. But it is still found in various parts of the world, Africa, Asia, and South America. And in 2017, 600 deaths worldwide were recorded due to plague. Let's just think a bit more about the Black Death, the second pandemic. It was also known as the pestilence or the Great Mortality. And this was the deadliest pandemic ever in human history. And estimates of between 75 and 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa died. It peaked in Europe in the middle 1300s. There are 2 types, bubonic and pneumonic plague, and it is transmitted by the bite of infected fleas, contact with infected tissues, and inhalation of droplets. So you may be asking, what does all this have to do with Jews? Well, I think it's fair to say that being a Jew in the during the Black Death was not a good time. Jews were often taken as scapegoats. Now, there's some debate about this, but it's said that Jews were less affected than other people. They lived separately to the main populations. There was less use of the common wells. And of course, there was ritual hand washing and bathing. But what is beyond doubt is that Jews were coerced through torture to confess to poisoning the wells. As a result of which, there were numerous massacres across Europe, Some of the more well-known are shown on the slide there, but most notoriously, 2,000 Jews were burnt alive in February 1349 in Strasbourg, and this was before the plague had even arrived there. The painting on the right is called the Pogrom of Strasbourg and was painted by a French artist, Emile Schweitzer, in 1894. Now, I want to talk about this chap, Waldemar Mordechai Hafkin. He was a Russian Jew born in an area that's now in the Ukraine, and he attended the University of Odessa and graduated in zoology. Whilst he was a student, he was a member of a Jewish League for Self-Defense, and indeed he was arrested on one occasion for defending a fellow Jew from an attack. Because of his Jewishness, he was barred from a professorship, and frustrated by this, he eventually made his way to Paris, and he took a job as a librarian at the Louis Pasteur Institute. But he continued to study, and he studied the cholera bacteria, which was work that Pasteur was undertaking. And Hafkin created an attenuated cholera vaccine. Now, attenuation is a process by which a virus or bacteria is made less virulent, but without killing it. In contrast, an inactivated vaccine is produced by killing the organism. An attenuated vaccine produces a stronger, faster, and more long-lasting immune response. Well, Hafkin tested his vaccine on animals and then decided to test it on himself. He suffered a fever, but made a full recovery. Now, this is a cholera bacterium, or Vibrio cholerae. And so in the early 1890s, India was rife with cholera. And the British ambassador in France, who was a former viceroy in India, requested the help of Hafkin in Paris. And so in 1894, Hafkin traveled to Calcutta with his vaccine and spent the first 12 months trying to find volunteers for the vaccine. Vaccination was an alien concept there, and the British authorities were said to be quite unwelcoming to him. After all, he was a Russian Jew, and he was a zoologist, not a doctor. Well, eventually there was a massive cholera outbreak in one of the busties or slums, and the locals came forward in greater numbers to be vaccinated, with a consequent reduction in incidence and fatalities. And Hafkin led a citywide campaign to vaccinate everybody. And it's said that he worked from morning till night in the slums, and he personally administered 23,000 vaccines in 12 months. This is a photograph of Hafkin working in Calcutta in 1894. Now, the following year, he moved to the tea plantations of Assam, and it said that he gave a further 42,000 cholera vaccinations. Not surprisingly, Hafkin developed malaria, and he was really quite poorly, and he had to leave India, and he went to England. And while he was in England, the third plague pandemic arrived in India from China, as I mentioned earlier, via the port of Bombay. It's said that the British authorities underplayed the severity of this because they were worried about the effects on trade and the economy. And if you think you might have heard that before, well, perhaps we won't go there. Anyway, the British authorities eventually turned to Hafkin for help for the second time. And he returned to India, to Bombay this time, and he set up a small laboratory with a single room, a clerk, and a couple of assistants. And working at a very rapid pace and with many difficulties, he developed the world's first plague vaccine in a mere 4 months. Again, he tested it on himself. This time he had a severe fever, but he recovered. And he began his vaccination campaign in a prison which had had a bad outbreak. And he worked night and day vaccinating people, and hundreds of thousands of people were vaccinated within a year. Hafkeen was eventually appointed the director of the Plague Research Laboratory in Bombay, and he was knighted by Queen Victoria. Well, of course, good things don't last, and in a small village near Bombay, 19 of the local people died deaths from tetanus after their plague vaccination. It was said that the vials were contaminated with tetanus. Well, this is a long story, but essentially the finger was pointed at Hafkeen, and he was fired from the laboratory and the Indian Civil Service, and he had to return to England. The plague continued to spread through India, but many lives continued to be saved by Hafkeen's vaccine. It was 4 years later when the official Indian report confirmed that Hafkeen was responsible. It was said that the vials of plague vaccine had been accidentally contaminated, but there were several inconsistencies in this report, and a prominent British physician took up Hafkeen's case, and in fact the matter was raised in Parliament, and eventually Hafkeen was fully exonerated. And he was allowed to return to his laboratory in Bombay, but he was banned from doing any clinical work or trials. He was just allowed to do laboratory work. And despite being fully exonerated, he was still made to feel responsible, and his next few years were both bleak and unproductive. And in 1915, aged just 55, he resigned and he left India. And he moved to France, and it's said that he became increasingly orthodox and devoted to Judaism. He never married, and he spent his final years alone in Lausanne in Switzerland. He died aged 70 in Lausanne and was described as a scholarly, lonesome, handsome man of few words who remained a bachelor. And the death notice shown also quotes Lord Joseph Lister, the pioneer of antiseptic surgery, who called Hafkeen the saviour of mankind. Over 28 years, 26 million doses of the plague vaccine were sent out from Bombay, with somewhere around a 50 to 80% reduction in plague mortality. Now, in my opinion, Hafkeen was really a great man. He was an educated, wealthy Russian Jew who'd worked in Paris at the Louis Pasteur Institute, but he later lived and worked in the slums of India, devoting himself to saving lives. He never became a household name, and of course his achievements were sullied in his lifetime, and it's a sad story in some ways. However, before his death, the Indian government renamed his lab the Hafkeen Institute, and the name remains to this day. And India released this stamp in 1964 commemorating Hafkeen. It's on a first day cover, and you can see the Hafkeen Institute is the illustration at the bottom left of the cover, and the Bombay GPO postmark shows Hafkeen's name. Israel in 1994 also issued a stamp. This again is on the first day cover, and on the tab of the stamp, that's the bottom bit, and also on the cover, you can see a copy of a handwritten entry in Hafkeen's own journal. And what he wrote was, "What to do against the plague in India by W.M. Hafkeen. The presence of the plague was announced publicly for the first time by the Bombay Municipal Corporation at the end of September 1896. By that time, some 20 cases daily were discovered." Now, just a few words on vaccination in general. It's known that in the 11th century that people in China would purposefully infect themselves with pus from smallpox pustules to protect against getting the full-blown disease. And this is a process called variolation. Historically, it's estimated that about 30% of all smallpox cases died, and that smallpox had killed more than 300 million people before the World Health Organization declared that it had been eradicated in the 1980s. Now, variolation really was quite risky. it usually caused a minor illness, but it could lead to full-blown disease and death. I'm sure that many of you will remember the name Edward Jenner, the English physician and scientist who pioneered the concept of vaccination. Well, Jenner noted that milkmaids working with cows were generally immune to smallpox, and he postulated that the pus in the cowpox blisters that milkmaids handled on cows protected them from smallpox. Cowpox is a similar but less virulent infection than smallpox. So what Jenner did was he took pus from the cowpox blister and injected it into his patients, and this did indeed protect them against smallpox. Now, this is a Great Britain First Day cover from 1999, commemorating 250 years since the birth of Jenner. And the stamps, the 4 stamps there, they're one of a set of 4 regarding science and invention. And if you look closely at the spots on the cow, you'll see that they illustrate Jenner about to stick a needle in what looks like a terrified child. And there's also a milkmaid at the bottom left of the stamp. And in 2010, Great Britain also released this stamp on the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society. This is the oldest national scientific institution in the world, and this shows Jenner and smallpox viruses. Okay, so how many vaccines were in use in 2020? Well, these are the ones that I know about. It may well be that there are lots more stored in laboratories that the public don't know about. In fact, I think we can be fairly certain that there are. But these are the known ones. And what I would say is that many of these have associations with Jewish scientists and developers. And I'm just going to look at a few of these where there's also a philatelic connection. Mechnikov was born in Russia, and his mother was Jewish, or some sources say of Jewish origin. It's not quite clear. But his father was an officer of the Imperial Guard. And he was a biologist who discovered macrophages or phagocytes. And these are white blood cells that engulf and destroy bacteria and other organisms in the blood. And this is part of cell-mediated immunity, which is the immune response that doesn't involve antibodies. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1908 for this work, jointly with Paul Ehrlich, who I'll come to shortly. And Mechnikov also coined the phrase gerontology for the study of aging and longevity. And he postulated that aging and illness were accelerated by toxic bacteria in the gut. And he drank sour milk every day for its lactic acid bacteria content. And when we think about the current vogue for probiotics, I would suggest that this dates back to Mechnikov's thinking. It's said that he was a brilliant but complex character. He also worked at the Louis Pasteur Institute in Paris, as well as various universities in Germany and Russia. Apparently, he made 2 suicide attempts in his life following personal problems, but eventually he lived to a good age and died a natural death. And France issued this stamp in 1966, shown on a First Day cover, on the 50th anniversary of his death, and there are 2 nice postmarks on that as well. Paul Ehrlich was a German Jew. His father was the leader of his local Jewish community, and he was a physician and a scientist. And in his early career, he assisted in the development of the technique of staining bacteria and tissue samples to aid disease diagnosis. And Ehrlich was interested in the idea of chemical and biological agents that could target specific disease cells in the body without affecting other healthy ones. And he came up with the concept of the Zauberkugel, or magic bullet. And he worked on the antibody immune response and observed that when the body is exposed to small but increasing doses of a disease toxin, the body developed a natural resistance to it, which would then protect it against that same disease. And he also observed that this immunity could be passed on in the uterus from a mother to her child, and this is called acquired immunity. In the 1890s, working with his colleague Emil von Behring, they developed the first treatment for diphtheria. But Ehrlich broke with von Behring when he concluded that von Behring was working behind his back to deny him credit and profits for this treatment. And rather sadly, in 1901, von Behring alone won the first Nobel Prize in Medicinal Physiology for their joint diphtheria cure. Anyway, a few years later, in 1909, Ehrlich was working on a cure for sleeping sickness, and by chance he found that one of the compounds he was testing worked as a cure for syphilis, which became the drug Salvarsan. Now, Salvarsan is termed the first magic bullet, and it was the most widely prescribed drug in the world at one point, and it remained the preferred treatment for syphilis until the arrival of penicillin in 1940. Ehrlich's work on antibodies was really critical in the developing field of immunology, and he shared the 1908 Nobel Prize with Elie Metchnikov, as I mentioned earlier. Shortly before he died, Ehrlich served on the board of the new Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Well, in 1930s Germany, the Nazis did their best to remove his work from the collective memory, removing his name from everything from publications to street names. Happily, everything was reinstated after the war. So Ehrlich was really another great man who left many legacies. There's a bacterium called Ehrlichia, which is named after him. The Paul Ehrlich Institute is the German Federal Institute for Vaccines and Biomedicines. A Hollywood film was made in 1940 called Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet. And would you believe it, a crater on the moon is also named after him. Now, a couple of stamps. The West Germany stamp on the left from 1954 commemorates the 100th anniversary of the births of Ehrlich and von Behring. And the stamp on the right was issued by Unified Germany in 2004 on the 150th anniversary of their births. And here is that stamp shown on a German first day cover. Israel also released a stamp in 1999. This is one of a set showing Jewish contribution to world culture, and Ehrlich is at the top right. Rudolf Weigel was not Jewish. He was a Polish zoologist, and before the Second World War, he employed about 1,000 people in his institute in Lviv in Poland, where he researched and developed a vaccine against typhus. Now, come the Second World War and the Nazi occupation of Poland, he came to the attention of the Nazis, and his institute became a Nazi research center. And he was ordered to produce typhus vaccine for Nazi troops dying of typhus on the Eastern Front. Typhus was also rampant in the Lviv and Warsaw ghettos, but Weigel employed and protected Jews in his institute, and he smuggled the vaccine into the ghettos. There were also regular epidemics of typhus in the concentration camps. And amongst those who was spared immediate death in the gas chambers of Bergen-Belsen, but died of typhus, was, of course, Anne Frank. And this is an Israeli stamp from 1988 on the 43rd anniversary of Anne's death, showing her and her Amsterdam house. After the war, Weigel continued working as a microbiologist, and production of typhus vaccine continued in Poland for some years before it was discontinued. And in 2003, 50 years after his death, Israel recognized Weigel as a righteous amongst the nations. Poland produced this set of stamps in 2011 of famous Polish people, and Weigel is at the bottom right. You'll see there's a microscope and typhus bacteria on the slide. And this is a Polish postcard from 1977. The theme appears to be something to do with churches. I really don't know, but it's got a Poznan postmark, a nice pictorial postmark commemorating Weigel. Now, although I know what you're thinking this looks like, it's actually a poliomyelitis virus. So a little bit on this. Major polio epidemics were unknown before the 20th century. And polio survived fairly quietly as an endemic infection until the 1900s, when major epidemics began to occur in Europe, followed by the United States. And by 1910, frequent epidemics became regular events through the developed world, mainly in cities during the summer months. And at its peak in the 40s and 50s, polio would paralyze or kill over 500,000 people worldwide every year. Now, in my medical career, I really didn't see much to do with polio. I certainly didn't see an acute case. I saw probably a handful of older patients who had paralysis from childhood polio. Undoubtedly, my most memorable event regarding polio occurred about 1 hour into an 11-hour flight from Tokyo to Amsterdam a few years ago, by which point we were flying over Siberia. Now, if any of you have ever done this flight, you'll know that if you can look down and you can see the land below, it is truly vast and it is a wilderness. You are a long way from anywhere. And what I recall is that I was obviously half asleep, but an announcement for a doctor went out, and almost in a reflex action, my arm shot up. And before I knew it, I was wedged into a little galley area with a Japanese lady lying prostrate on a trolley, wedged up against the Dutch air stewardess, being asked what were we going to do about this lady's stroke and whether or not we may have to consider diverting the plane. Now, this felt like somewhat of a responsibility, and I know that doctors don't make the final decisions in these instances. It's made by somebody on the ground, but all the same, it did feel quite onerous. I can't really remember how the next half hour ensued, because even though I'd spent 2 weeks in Japan, being lazy as I am, I had no Japanese whatsoever, nor did the lady have much English. But to cut a long story short, I eventually managed to work out that the left-sided paralysis of her arm and her leg was not actually due to a stroke, but she'd had childhood polio, and her complaint at the time was probably just a headache or a migraine or something like that. So the plane kept on its merry way, and the disaster was averted. It's not actually the first time that's happened to me on a plane, but that's another story. For my efforts, KLM gave me a cup of tea and one of those ceramic Dutch houses. In fairness to them, I did get some air miles before a few weeks had passed. Now, Jonas Salk was a Jew born in New York. His mother was a Russian immigrant, and he qualified in medicine and worked in polio research, identifying different strains. And he developed the world's first polio vaccine using an inactivated virus. In 1954, he tested the vaccine on about 1 million children, known as the polio pioneers. And the following year, the vaccine came into public use. He actually chose not to patent the vaccine or take any financial profit from it. And by 1959, the Salk vaccine had reached about 90 countries. By the mid-1980s, polio was virtually eliminated from most of the first world, and now from most of the entire world. Salk also worked on research on an AIDS vaccine in the 1980s. And the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, founded in 1960 in San Diego, undertakes research in molecular biology, genetics, neurosciences, and plant biology. Two stamps. The one on the left is from the US from 2006, one of their Distinguished Americans series, and the one on the right is a Trans-Chi stamp from 1991. There are literally dozens, if not scores, of stamps worldwide on the theme of polio vaccination, particularly from third world countries, understandably, and there simply isn't the time to look at that this evening. And here is the US stamp on a first day cover showing Salk. The illustration shows Salk holding a polio vaccine, a little girl on crutches on a globe, and the Salk Institute. Albert Sabin was a Russian-born Jew, born as Avram Saperstein. The family emigrated to America in 1921, where they anglicized their name. And he gained science and then medical degrees. And in his early years working as a doctor, he developed an interest in infectious diseases. And during the Second World War, whilst in the Army Medical Corps, he helped develop a vaccine against Japanese encephalitis. And he actually worked alongside Jonas Salk in polio research. And he discovered that while Salk's vaccine was effective in preventing most of the complications of polio, it didn't prevent the initial intestinal infection. And he demonstrated that the polio virus attacked the intestines before it moved to the central nervous system. So he developed an oral vaccine delivered on a sugar cube, licensed in 1961. And I suspect that some of you, like me, remember clearly standing in your GP surgery, putting that sugar cube in your mouth. Now, there was some public opposition to this because Salk's vaccine had been so effective, but Sabin's oral vaccine was easier to give than Salk's injectable vaccine, and its effects lasted longer. And the Sabin vaccine became the predominant method of polio vaccination for the next 30 years. Like Salk, Sabin refused to patent his vaccine and take a profit. In later life, Sabin lived and worked in Israel before returning to the US. He won multiple awards and recognition, including being honored by the Soviet Union for his work. And the Sabin Vaccine Institute in Washington was founded in 1993. The top stamp is a Brazilian stamp from 1994, issued on the first anniversary of Sabin's death. And the bottom one is also from 2006, the Distinguished Americans series from the US. And here is that stamp on a US first day cover. What you're looking at here are malarial parasites attacking red blood cells. Before the First World War, under the Ottomans, Palestine was absolutely ridden with malaria, and entire regions were abandoned due to it. And many people were killed each year. 20% of the population suffered from the disease at any one time. During the First World War, malaria was a major problem for General Allenby's forces, and his chief medical officer described Palestine as one of the most malaria-afflicted countries in the world. In the latter part of the 19th century, until the onset of the First World War, approximately 75,000 Eastern European Jews settled in Palestine, but by the onset of the war, about half of this number had left, unable to cope due to malaria, and many had died. Now, this is a pre-1948 postcard of the Hula swamp in northern Israel. And obviously it's black and white, but you do get a sense of what a bleak, barren, desolate swamp it was. I want to mention this chap, Israel Kligler, who was a Russian-born microbiologist. He worked with the British mandatory government during the 1920s fighting malaria. And what they did was they drained the swamps, and he imported fish to put in the swamps, fish that eat mosquito larvae. This really was a monumental effort, and there's no doubt that Israel would not have developed as it did without Kligler's work. As a result of which, malaria started to decline in the 1920s, and this decline continued through the next few decades. And in the 1960s, Israel was declared to be malaria-free, the first country in Asia to be rid of the disease. Now, quite astonishingly, in my opinion, there are no Israeli stamps featuring Kligler, but they did issue a stamp in 1962 celebrating the eradication of malaria. And here it is on what's called a maximum card. That's a postcard which contains the same theme as the stamp, and the postmark is on the day of issue of the stamp. So thinking back to that postcard of the Hula Swamp, in 2007, Israel released this set of stamps of what is now known as the Hula Nature Reserve, a set of 3 stamps, and it's shown on a first day cover. I recall with great fondness a day that my late father and I spent there back in 2009. It was an idyllic spring sunny day, and it really is beautiful, and I recommend any of you who are next in Israel to pay a visit to the Hula Nature Reserve. Saul Adler was born in Russia. His father was a rabbi, and the family came to England in 1900 when Saul was 5 years old, and they settled in Leeds. He studied medicine at Leeds University and qualified in 1917. And he took a commission in the Royal Army Medical Corps and was posted to Mesopotamia, where he developed an interest in tropical medicine. After DMOB, he studied and worked at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. That's the building I showed you right at the outset. Adler was also a committed Zionist, and he moved to Palestine in 1924, and he worked at the Hebrew University in the Department of Microbiology. Eventually, he became professor of parasitology, and he continued in this post until his death. In the 1940s, he was a leader in researching the disease leishmaniasis, and he developed a leishmaniasis vaccine. And this was used until the 1980s, when it had to be discontinued because, unfortunately, it led to long-term skin lesions and immunosuppression in some people. Adler was also famous for successfully breeding in captivity the wild Syrian hamster, and you can see one on his arm in the photograph. And he introduced this hamster to research laboratories in Israel. And he subsequently distributed them to labs in the UK, the US, and India. And it's speculated, although who knows, that all the captive hamsters in US laboratories are descended from the 2 females and 1 male that he bred in Jerusalem. On the 100th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, Adler translated the book into Hebrew. This is an Israeli stamp from 1994 on the birth centenary minus a year of Adler. And both the stamp and the tab and the first day cover show stages in the life cycle of the leishmaniasis parasite, transmission by the sandfly and also a Syrian hamster. And the postmark shows the leishmaniasis parasite. Baruch Humberg was born in Brooklyn. His parents were 2nd-generation immigrants, and he qualified in medicine in 1951. And throughout the 1950s, he studied genetic variations in humans, asking the question of why some people contract a disease in a given environment while others don't. And he traveled the world, and in 1964, he discovered the antigen for hepatitis B in the blood of an Australian Aborigine, and hence it was initially called the Australian antigen. And I remember using that phrase in my early career. And he later demonstrated that the hepatitis B virus could cause liver cancer. And his team developed a screening test for the virus to prevent its spread in blood transfusions. In 1976, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for this work. And in the 1980s, he developed a hepatitis B vaccine. And approximately 1 billion people have had this vaccine, with an estimated 25 million lives saved. In the late 1980s, he moved to the UK to Oxford University, and he became the first American master of Balliol College. And later in life, he was associated with the Oxford Antiviral Drug Discovery Unit. And this is currently involved in research on treatment and production of vaccines for COVID-19, as we've all heard. Blumberg had many achievements, including being the president of the American Philosophical Society, and he was also a NASA scientist in astrobiology. And apparently he attended weekly Talmud classes until his death. And the Maldives issued this set of stamps in 1995, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize, and Blumberg is in the center. Cesar Milstein was born in Argentina. His parents were Ukrainian Jews who'd emigrated, and he worked in the field of antibody research, and he developed the technique for the production of monoclonal antibodies. Now, a monoclonal antibody is an antibody made by cloning a single white blood cell. And nowadays they are widely used in the fields of diagnostics and the treatment of cancer, autoimmune diseases, and infections. Milstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1984 for his work. And if we think back to Paul Ehrlich 100 years earlier and his magic bullet, a treatment that could precisely target a disease, well, essentially monoclonal antibodies do just this. And they're currently being used to treat COVID. So people who've had COVID and have mounted a strong immune response, they have their immune proteins artificially replicated. And this all stems from the work of Milstein. And Argentina released this stamp in 2005, commemorating his work and his Nobel Prize. This is not actually a first day cover. The envelope refers to Argentina-Israel relationships. And so we come right up to the modern day, and this is Alfred Bourla, a Greek Jew who is the son of Holocaust survivors. And he's also the CEO and chairman of Pfizer. And Pfizer, of course, is on everyone's lips for its COVID vaccine. There really are many, many other associations between Jews and the history of plagues, immunology, and vaccine development. And tonight really was just a taste of things. So in conclusion, the world remains very busy fighting our current plague, vaccinating entire populations, and dealing with the economic and human effects of multiple lockdowns. But maybe for generations, the Jewish community has had something very fundamental that helps when you're ill. In fact, Maimonides himself recommended it. It may not cure you, but it certainly makes you feel better. That's right, Jewish penicillin, chicken soup. At which point I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll hand back to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Max. That was absolutely fascinating. I understand there's also an Albert Schmelzer who was in charge of the R&D department at AstraZeneca in developing the vaccine. And there was talk at one time that people who thought they should boycott companies that had prominent Jews amongst the directors might have to say to themselves that they couldn't take either Pfizer or AstraZeneca. But hopefully they decided that in spite of the Jewish connections, they would go ahead and protect themselves and us. Does anybody have any questions for Max? Can you unmute yourself? Gary, you've got a question, Gary? Can you unmute?
No, sorry, I didn't have a question. Sorry, no.
Oh, right.
But I can always think of a question. I'd just like to say that it's very interesting talk, Max. Well done.
Thank you.
Who would you admire most out of all the physicians and scientists and that you've come across?
Well, they're all admirable in their own way, aren't they? I think Hafkeen was an extraordinary man because of what he gave up and the hardship that he suffered in his lifetime. And, I didn't mention it at the time. There's nothing recorded in the literature about overt anti-Semitism, but I strongly suspect that that played a part in his fall from grace. I think Hafkeen was really a great man.
Anybody else?
I'll just make a comment. My grandfather in 1912 produced a treatment for TB, not a vaccine, but a treatment. And unfortunately, it got lost due to the anti-Semitism and so on. But I suspect there may be other treatments like that that, were undermined through the Nazi regime. I'm at the moment working in microbiology, trying to bring his treatment back.
Oh, I see. Right. Well, I do hope I didn't say anything that was not correct. I didn't know we had a microbiologist.
Well, I'm not an expert. I am becoming a microbiologist. I'm no expert, and you sounded excellent to me.
Thank you.
Has anybody calculated actually how many lives have been saved by Jewish work in this area?
I suppose it's incalculable, isn't it? How do you prove that a life was saved anyway? But it's obvious if somebody is dying, then you can save their life. But if somebody doesn't develop an infection anyway, you don't know what might have happened.
Is there what's the earliest reference to transmittable diseases caused by viruses?
Might it be leprosy in the Bible?
Yep. Is that transmittable though?
Yes, it is. I mean, there may be literature that predates the Bible, but I don't know. That's my guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is literature, but there is, whether or not it relates to infections, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Hi, Gary.
It must have been infectious, Max, because they used to send people with leprosy to leper colonies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm.
Any other contributions or questions for Max? Right. All right, Max. Well, thank you very much. It's been enthralling. I saw the original one, but I've still got taken an awful lot from your reprise. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us in Wimbledon, and we hope on some occasion we'll be able to meet you face to face. So
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. That was interesting. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, I'm going to end the meeting.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.